especially it's good to be here with you all. I'm especially grateful for your patience and that we had to postpone this while I traveled cross country to be with family. And so our time today is to take a look um, at the to go deeper into what we started with, which was the conflict ecosystem, and specifically to look at ways to kind of foster connection when we're having conflict. So I'm going to start with uh, sharing my screen. One moment. Okay, let's see. Okay, got that. And oops, struggling a little bit to find the screen. I have too many things open. Okay, let me try this differently. Okay. Oh, let's see what happened. Okay, I figured it out. Sorry for my inelegant use of screen sharing on Zoom. It's one of the things I continue to struggle with. Okay, I'm gonna share screen. Okay, got it. All right. So what we looked at the last time when we've presented information about the conflict life cycle and to try and to capture so many of the things that are part of the conflicts that we often find ourselves a part of, and what it takes to actually so that we get a clearer sense of like what's on the table or what are the considerations when we're looking at conflict. So we looked at, again, drawing from some tools within nonviolent communication, observations, feelings, looking at needs, particularly here unmet needs, and then how that shapes the choices that we have, and how understanding those choices allows us to move through strategy and ultimately end up with greater connection. So we're looking at ways of disrupting conflict with the narratives that we have. And so, oops, I'm gonna go back here. So we start often first with these observations, which traditionally we hold as things that you would see or hear. It could also include systemic observations, things that may not be seen or heard, but are present and shape what our individual experiences might be. We, oopsie, we looked at feelings again, because oftentimes that there is an emotional component to conflict, and then how you can translate those feelings into unmet needs. Um, so we looked at next, and the way that we're holding it is that we're wanting to share with you all ways of engaging with conflict in a way that allows us to do things from a needs-based perspective in order to um, look after some of the risks that comes with different ways of engaging with conflict that are, for example, around scarcity and competition, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation, our time together. Um, and so within the conflict ecosystem, um, you have these individuals or the two sides of a conflict that are shaped by identities, personal history, unconscious bias, capacity, and judgments. And what is happening between us, or the space for growth or for disruption, is based off of things like the level of trust. What is the reality around how power and privilege are shaping what's happening between people? What's actually part of your relationship history with that person and is shaping the expectations that you have? And so surrounding that is the culture of the systems that we are all in. So it matters, for example, if you're in, say, for example, a workplace in which and the culture of that place. Same thing for a community group, a faith group, an activist group. The norms that you have, the agreements that you have, both known and both said and not said, shape how a conflict can be engaged and the result of it. And what also shapes it is your shared purpose. So the reasons why it is that you've come together in the first place. And outside of that, we have these different sets of norms and ideologies, agreements, systemic oppression, the culture of the larger society, laws that also are part of the ecosystem of what is shaping conflict. So then the question then comes up then around how then do we move through this in a way that can foster greater connection and care? And so we thought we'd come to you with this scenario around, and the scenario reads as such: your group has decided on sociocracy as its form of governance. 3 months after the decision was made, a member of your group sent a message on the group chat saying, "We're making a mistake using sociocracy." And the project leader, who's responsible for the rollout of sociocracy, has written back to the member to say, "You're not giving this a chance. We agreed to this months ago and are on time with our transition. Sending missives like this don't help." So that's the scenario. Checking to see if that's like sufficiently clear. And I think that we'll probably, is it possible for us to cut and paste this into the chat, Catherine, just so that it's available to you, because we're going to move on to
Yeah, I can do that.
some other slides. And so I think we'll just stay in the larger group because we are a smaller group. So the question that I have for you is, looking at that scenario, what is the observation? And so when we're talking about observations, again, observations are, they're kind of meant to reserve judgment and just to kind of focus on what there could be shared agreement on, what you can see in here. And then once we take a look at the observations, we'll take a look to see if there are other dynamics that might be shaping it. But that's the very first question I have is, what are the observations that is present in this scenario? I just invite you to unmute yourself, put in the chat if you would like. I'm going to take down the shared screen so that way I can see more of you. And I welcome, maybe if you to think about it a little bit, then do so, but I welcome anyone to share their voice for the benefit of the group's learning.
I'll just pipe in with something. It
Yeah.
feels like maybe the channel that this was put out on is something that it seemed like it was surprising to the group. Maybe there should have been an agreement in advance that if anyone, as this thing is progressing, has any comments or that they do it in a way that seems less likely to kind of ambush the leaders.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just felt like that came as a surprise,
Yeah.
and now they have to deal with the.
Yeah, certainly it seems like that way with the project leader. So I think the observation part that I would lift up from what you shared, Bruce, was that things were shared on the channel and that there could be some indication that what was shared was unexpected, at least for the project leader. So thank you for that. Catherine, welcoming your voice.
There. Yeah, the first thought that I had when I saw this was I kind of projected myself into the position of the project leader, and I felt very confronted. And I was trying to imagine how this could have been presented in a way that would not have made me feel defensive. And I think that if this individual had expressed a concern about what his or her actual feeling was, rather than we are making a mistake, that it would have been less likely to trigger me.
Right. Thank you for that. So the observation piece that I would lift up there is that one, that the person who was making the comment about sociocracy was kind of speaking for the royal we without there being evidence that was coming from a we. And also that I'm hearing that a guess is that it could be received in a way that was confronting, especially to the project leader, because of the format or the platform that it was on. Thank you so much for that, Catherine. And is it Rav welcoming your voice?
Yes, thanks. The first thing that I noticed in this was the thing that jumped out to me was the project leader responded with, "You're not giving it a chance." And in the first paragraph, it says that this has been going on or the transition has been going on for 3 months. So the first thing I noticed is maybe there's a difference between what people are perceiving as a timeline for feedback or like
Mhm.
evaluation of the transition.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, right? Because there has been time given. So it's possible, like, and we'll talk about this, that for the person who raised it in the group, that 3 months is a chance. But the other thing, if you notice in the scenario, is that the project leader is talking about timeline. So the project leader might have a different understanding of what is a reasonable amount of time. And we know that the project leader, or we can guess that the project leader is pulling from a timeline, or we know this because it's been said, whereas we don't know how the person who's raising this as a concern is evaluating time. So thank you for that. Okay, and is it Sri? Am I saying that correct?
Yes, yes. Thank you for asking. I just, an observation for me is group chat versus a conversation. Um,
Mhm.
just the ways in which, there's a lot of ways in which we can just add our interpretation to tone, or we just add tone. We add a lot of things
Yeah.
to this, and a lot of that is reacting from our own, like you said, the project lead frustration, maybe this person's sense of, I don't know what we are making a mistake or,
Yeah.
to them and what part of it. So there's not ever enough, it's not enough information. And then it can just escalate into a conversation that was not even the original conversation. So I just think a lot about conversation or dialogue versus group chats.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm hearing you lift up that in some ways having a group chat might be introducing a constraint that's not helpful for understanding or for connecting. So thank you for naming that. Okay. All right. Brendan and then Heather.
Yeah, the word timeline was interesting to me. I thought of the word structure too, that the deciding on sociocracy, they had this work that they were working on a new format for their organization, and they coming together, and they had a transitional period, and so they kind of did have a mission. So when the person sent that message, and like the word missive was used, and it was kind of like the person was on the leader was kind of like instantly on their own missive against that person for sending that criticism. It was just an interesting, like, yeah, to resonate on some of the other comments about the tone and that it is a conflict kind of quality rather than a more open conversation or dialogue that's more just gentler, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of the things that you're naming we'll look at that as we go through feelings and needs as well. So thank you for that. Heather, and then we're gonna go to the next slide.
Yeah, for me, one thing that comes up is maybe a question, or what isn't there to observe is what would have been the other, or are there other avenues that were already within the structure?
Yeah.
How the communication could have happened. Like
Yeah.
what is the system that it is working?
Mhm.
for
That's great.
community?
That's great to kind of go with that level of curiosity. All right. I'm gonna go back to sharing the screen. And we're gonna move next to what feelings may be up. And we want to make some guesses. We're just making guesses for the sender, the person who sent the message on them, and for the receiver. Now we know that there are more than one receiver because it's a group chat, but we only have information so far. We only have dialogue from the project leader, but if you want to make room for consideration of other receivers, that's welcomed as well. It's because the reason why we're looking at the guesses is because they're important for us to get to the place we're trying to get to, which is trying to understand what the human needs are. And because we want to make room for the consideration of the whole person, because there's a tendency to kind of move to just the facts, and people are not just a collection of facts. Relationship matters, tone matters, all those things. So we're trying to get to that, move to that place of needs, which is what we'll look at in the next one. And the thing about guesses around feelings is that they don't, especially in conflict, they don't necessarily have to be named with other people, but we invite the we invite the consideration of it just so that we can help. It helps us to connect to our own sense of human feeling and to the feelings that are present. And so it might shape the choices that we make. We don't necessarily have to share them with others, especially in conflict. So would love to hear any guesses for the sender or the receiver.
Well, the sender is frustrated.
Yeah.
They've been sitting on this, and now it's coming out in the form not even of a question but a statement. They're so sure that they're not the only one who's frustrated that they're claiming it as a feeling for the whole group.
Right. Thank you. Maybe a couple more guesses. Had frustration name. Oh yeah, Sri, welcoming your voice, and then we'll go to Catherine.
Well, I was looking at all those emoji expressions and I'm like, they could have put any one of those at the end and it would have made sense. Like it could have been any of them. Like I can't even guess what that is because it could have been like we're making a mistake question mark. I don't know. I guess it's a period, but I feel like that's the thing around this is it's I wonder like if the response could be, well, say more. Or something that's an invitation to, because it doesn't really tell you much other than, and you could read anything into that. Like I just that those the group of emojis you shared are really interesting to me because it's almost like that could punctuate it with how I would respond. Like any of those emotions could fit. So I don't know.
We seem to have lost Leonie. No. Here, she'll be back any second now. Not quite sure what happened. But sorry, Sri, you were sharing that it's hard to kind of nail down or discern what emotion was coming from that that statement, and that it's possible that there could be a number of emotions. It could be curiosity, it could be concern, it could be frustration, as Bruce pointed out, it could be alarm, it could, it's probably not joy, but
Well, I mean, it's just interesting because where does that stuff come from? And I'm really bad at doing this. It's trying to be intentional about doing it better. But the idea of like, I just want to know more versus like, how I read it, because I can read things in so many ways. And I think that that's been the problem with like group chats or emails, how long you spend trying to like compose it in a certain way. And now and how
Yeah,
rarely we resist just picking up the phone when things get hard.
yeah,
I-
and what I'm hearing and what you're sharing, what I appreciate is the curiosity, and
Mm,
part of this step of guessing at feelings is to kind of push us into that place of curiosity and to imagine like what is going on for that person, and as being as expansive as possible. You're naming a lot of like just that willingness to, if I received a message like that, instead of responding the way the person did, responding by, can you tell me more? Or or pick up the phone, as you said, and just reach out and try to get more information. And often we don't do that. So what I'm appreciating about what you're sharing is that for you, that seems to be a natural instinct. And you're also seeing the value of that in terms of disrupting conflict and possibly preventing it from going down the road that as you say, can completely undermine what's happening. So thanks for sharing that.
yeah,
And
and I
Leonie,
think,
sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
I think if we're, as the diagram that Leonie shared earlier, I think if we're talking about this group, I'm assuming there are those relationships. So there is that avenue for curiosity and questions as a way, as part of this group kind of dynamics or the group commitments to each other. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and that can be part of that conflict ecosystem that Leonie showed the slide around, is like, does your community have agreements around how do we attend to something when it comes up? Like, what are the processes that we agree to? What are the what are some of the norms that we have? So I'm going to hand it over to Leonie at this point. Does that
Sorry
make
about
sense,
that.
Leonie? Yeah, no worries.
My Windows crashed. It just crashed. So um I'm gonna take a risk here and also add a comment because I think I caught the thread of that. Is that oftentimes when we're in groups, conflict can come out of nowhere, even if we have a clear sense of shared purpose, even if we've had good relationships, because people often don't know how to engage in conversations of difference. And it can actually feel like it's more difficult when things have been going smoothly to be the one to disrupt. So that's why the culture of the group is important. It's not just about intention, it's about capacity and capabilities to be able to speak across difference. Yeah. Okay, my order of things, I'm seeing Catherine and Heather, and I'm assuming we're still in feelings. Okay, so yeah, let's hear from them both. Catherine, welcoming your voice, and then Heather.
The immediate feelings that came up for me when I read that was, this person feels impatient to me, maybe worried about how the group is going to function, or if it's going to be effective, maybe even threatened. I didn't see that word on the list, but it came up for me right away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are excellent. Yeah, those are excellent guesses. Especially because the word about the group, even though the person speaking in the royal we don't have a sense of it, it could speak a little bit or give us a glimpse into potentially what their motivation is. Like it's out of care for the group that they're raising the objection, which is different than doing it just out of obstinacy or something else. It shapes how we can engage. So thank you for that. Heather, welcoming your voice.
Thank you. Yes, I was similar to Catherine. I was thinking, just feeling impatience from the person, and then fear was the other thing that came up. So similar to the worriedness, right? Just an uncertainty. The person potentially isn't comfortable or doesn't know a lot enough to feel comfortable with that approach potentially.
Yeah.
Although it does or does know and has had experience in the past that hasn't gone well potentially.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, just a sense of fear was the other.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you so much, yeah, for your contribution. So we're going to take a look. So within conflict, again, pulling from something that is common within nonviolent communication, is these feelings at this point, as I said earlier, are guesses. They're not going to be, they have to still be affirmed by somebody else, and they may or may not be. But then the thing with feelings within NVC is that we want to, in order to make them useful, we want to connect them to needs. And I'm going to, again, reshare my screen, and hopefully it will be okay with it. Let's see. Okay. Okay. And here we go. Okay. So we're looking at, in this case, conflict often comes out of unmet needs, or will come out of unmet needs. And so we're trying, this is what we're trying to get to. This is kind of like the center of the conversation, because when we have conversations that are at the needs level, it keeps us in the zone of like what is meaningful. When we first engage in a conflict, if we move into going straight to strategies without understanding why somebody is taking the position that they have, you just can end up in a back and forth. And sometimes you can end up in a back and forth that's an actual back and forth happening in real time. And sometimes you can end up in a back and forth that is just about disengagement, and perhaps can turn into things like disengagement, gossip, othering, all kinds of other behaviors can come forth. But when we are engaging at the needs level, what widens the window of what's welcome, in terms of what we're going to be able to explore, because we're going out of black-white thinking, STEM thinking. Needs in and of themselves, when we're talking about human needs, are expansive, because just even as I said before, even when we're talking about feelings, if we are attached to motivations that have to do with care, then that shapes the kind of conversation that we're going to have. And so in this way, it's different from strategies, because strategies tend to be collapsing and not expansive, because we're in a place of right wrong thinking, and it's about it can introduce competition and scarcity. The other thing to keep in mind about strategies is that, remember in the original diagram, we talked about the influence of the culture of the group that you're with, but also of just like in society, like in general. The reality is that the status quo is to think of things in terms of strategies, meaning that right wrong thinking is our default. Competition, scarcity is our default. And so needs are inviting us to go below that level in order to understand what's meaningful. So that leads us to the question, what are the needs? Which needs do we want to be considering? So we can look things at the interpersonal level. So what's happening within myself, that's the interpersonal, looking at what's happening within our own needs. At the interpersonal level, what are you trying to create between you? Like, what is it that you're wanting to bring relationship-wise between you and the other person who's in that conversation? We can look at things at the systemic or organizational community, whatever system that you're in, to look at, are there needs that can emerge that from the mission, the vision, the values, and other systemic parts. And also looking at needs that emerge that attend to things that are systemic, that are external, like the impact of the isms, racism, sexism, credentialism. And the reason why we want to take a look at this is, or we invite the consideration of these things, is because we want to get a sense of what is, like, to put as much as is needed on the table when we're looking at needs, as opposed to when we're looking at strategies and we're going just back and forth. Again, it tends to collapse the conversation. So maybe I'd love to hear like a guess around the interpersonal need, both for the person who made the initial comment and for the project leader. What could be happening inside of them, or needs that are coming up for them. And it could be based on, and it's often good to base it on the feelings that have been named. We talked about impatience and frustration and fear, that type of thing. So, and I'd love to hear guesses for both.
I feel like for both, it's just they both want to shut it down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you have a sense of why they want to shut it down? Like internally?
I think it's somebody used the word derail, I think, in the
Mm-hmm.
comment or in the chat, and I found, I don't know, that word is resonating with me a lot. Like it's
Yeah.
they don't want to be derailed. Or it
Yeah.
feels, yeah.
Yeah. And that's speaking to another thing that happens oftentimes is conflict avoidance. People often, when differences are coming, will move to a place of wanting to shut things down because people are afraid or don't have the skills to actually engage in conflict. So thank you so much for naming that. Heather, welcoming your voice.
I'm thinking similarly, and when I look at the list here, I wonder about consistency, just the not wanting change
Yeah,
potentially. So wanting
yeah,
things to stay
yeah. And
contained.
that could easily apply to both, right? Like,
Mhm.
yeah. And so that's the thing that's often true within needs. When we're looking at conflict, is that people are engaging in different behavior, but the needs are often not that far apart or can be exactly the same. So thank you for naming that. And then at the interpersonal, oh yeah, Bruce will welcome your voice. Now take a look at the interpersonal.
Oh,
Leonie, there's also some in the chat, some guesses that
Oh,
were put in
okay.
the chat.
Yep, I'll bring that. We'll name that later after. Thank you.
sorry, this isn't super important, but my feeling is that the group leader is worried about losing the room, losing their authority to lead, and which is a fairly deep need if you're you're hoping that, and you realize that things can come a cropper pretty quickly if a sort of a mutiny develops. And
Yeah,
I feel like that's a pretty deep-seated fear or insecurity that is being triggered
yeah,
there
yeah. So
in,
that's
in the
some
group.
nuance. Thank you. That's a nuance on the fear piece around what could they be fearful of? Losing authority, losing, yeah, some sense of control as well. Thank you so much for that, Bruce. So in the chat, I see needs of care, communication, and engagement named, and also order, structure to be known. And we also have for the sender, relevance, to make the best choice, for the receiver, to keep things managed and moving forward, as well as we have needs of safety, harmony, respect, to be trusted, heard, and seen. So when we are looking, this is such a great set of needs that we've been able to talk about that have not been met, because when we are looking at things from this consideration through this lens, again, it helps us to think outside of the usual competition, or a sense of like, we're in an argument that we need to win. We're actually being invited into what are other considerations that are up for us that we want to consider. And when we look at additional needs, then would love to hear some guesses about the systemic. So this is, again, needs that emerge, perhaps because of our understanding of the mission, vision, values, or needs that emerge because they come from external factors that still shape how it is that we are, which is, for example, racism, sexism, patriarchy, that kind of thing. So any guesses for those types of needs that are coming up? And again, these are all just guesses. They're going to be affirmed through dialogue or not.
Can you actually repeat the question or reframe what you're asking
Yeah.
at this level? Thanks.
So yeah, so it was to look at the do we have any needs guesses around the systemic? I'm going to actually reshare the slide. So the systemic can include needs that emerge from the mission, vision, or values, because it can help to also help us to understand what's framing or where people are drawing meaning from, or needs that emerge from systemic factors that are external to the organization, such as the impact of racism, sexism, patriarchy, credentialism. Is that sufficiently clear?
I think so. I'll listen and then I'll
Okay.
understand maybe when there's some examples. Thank you.
Yeah. And this is a stretch part because we often don't consider these things when we're in conflict. But the reason why we're looking at this is because oftentimes what looks like interpersonal difference is actually the system trying to tell you something. So it's showing up as, you know, John and Mary aren't getting along, but actually it's because the policy wasn't clear or the direction wasn't clear. So this is what we're looking, or perhaps people are touching on each other's trauma fields. So we're just inviting those considerations. So any guesses?
I don't know if this is really answering your question, but what I find really powerful in that is the idea of the common ground is the organization or the group that we're part of. And the idea, I find it really powerful thinking of, well, what is the need? When you were saying earlier about how a lot of times it's the same. So what is the need of the organization or the group? And being able to kind of find a common ground like that to work from
Yeah.
is kind of exciting. You know, it feels like a way to embrace or you know,
Yeah.
invite ourselves into the conflict to have that conversation.
Yeah.
It's about the work.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that the work is definitely a part of it, which I think, I mean, and this might be different than your experience, but I think that oftentimes when we're in a conflict, because it's happening at the interpersonal level, we don't actually stop to think of, do we have the same understanding? Do we have a shared understanding what the mission is here? Are we interpreting things differently here? Do we have a shared understanding of what the priority is? Because then you can have a conversation about that, about clarifying where you're at, as opposed to trying to win one over. Win, the words aren't going to come to me, but I think you know what I mean. This.
Being
Yeah,
right.
so thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm just gonna look at a couple things in the chat. So Western systems heavily rely on adversarialness, so people may be always competing for their perspective, ideas, feelings, needs, etc., to be centered or validated. So true. And Western systems is what we're living in, and it's what has shaped us, and it's what has shaped our education. You can be very successful in Western within like companies with this kind of mentality. So the consideration of needs helps us to break that open a little bit. But it's important to know that we're swimming in that soup. That's what we're in. We don't swim in soup, we swim in the water. We're swimming in that water. And also it says keep a hierarchy or decision-based order where the message was not a good fit. And solidarity kept in presence, feeling, and feeling appearance. So thank you for those contributions. And so the reason why I also want to look at the systemic from like the external factors is some of this might shift, for example, if we're talking about male presenting, female presenting, white identified person, person of color, someone in their 60s, someone in their 20s, right? All of those, who we are shapes how we show up when difference is in the room. And so we want to make room just for consideration for what those are. How perhaps am I being received? How am I showing up? What can I do to help to the parties involved know that even if there is a difference, that I'm still interested in hearing their perspective. Who gets to have needs? who gets to, you know, speak with dominance in the room, because these aren't just things that are just shaped by our individual choices. They're shaped by the systems that we live in. We live in, again, in Western systems that favor certain voices over other voices. And that's also would be amplified by the cultures that we're in. So what's true for the culture within our particular faith community, or within our activist group, or within our nonprofit, all of those things help to inform. So we're just inviting some consideration for some of those things, and we're looking at engaging in conflict in a different way. Any clarifying questions or reactions? And we're going to take a next we're going to talk about some interventions. But anything else that's coming up for people? And please feel free to jump in with questions as we move forward. So, resharing again. So what are the ways then that we can, what are some interventions and language, because so much of this is about language, to help us to move through these moments in a way that's still caring and connecting. So when we're talking about observations, the invitation is to describe what you remember, what you can recall, and to ask somebody if that matches their recollection. The value of this is that you're having a conversation about the same thing. You want to make sure that you're on the same page. If it turns out that they have differences, you want to be able to include their observations within this. And notice that this is not about a fact finding, because if somebody names an observation, perhaps in the systemic level, people are always operating from their own reality. And so this is why it's important that we want to invite that conversation. So when you hear a judgment or an opinion, perhaps when someone's naming that in the observation phase, maybe you can rephrase it, which normally has one T, but today it's special and has two, as an observation. So for example, person A might say, you prefer sociocracy. Telling someone what their preference is a judgment. And it's not confirmed, and it doesn't acknowledge that the choice was with the group and not an individual. If you say, if the person who named the first enter the information into the chat came and said that you prefer, it doesn't make room for these other pieces. So perfect person B then might my reference around might say that my reference around the decision for sociocracy is through the acceptance of emotion that was agreed to by all. So someone has named a judgment, and you reflect back it as your observation by actually sharing, and you can be descriptive. Actually, it's not so much about my preference, but it's also it's been shaped because we did have this conversation. It's minuted. It was in emotion, and it included a timeline, and that we would take on sociocracy. Just want to check to see, is that any questions there, or is that sufficiently clear? So judgments will come in while people are naming observations, and we're wanting to try to strip them back and to just name actually what's real and what exists. Or perhaps you have a different example that you'd like to maybe have a question on. Is it an observation or is it a judgment? Because that does take some nuance as well.
I do have a question, Andy, if it's okay for me to ask it.
Yes.
I think when it comes to a lot of the interactions, especially when it comes to conflict, like one's own perception is a key role that is played in the whole scenario. But also what I'm seeing, especially in the workplace or post, high stress times that we've been living in, a lot of people respond from their place of trauma, or like not having done their own individual learning or understanding. And so sometimes that kind of takes over the intended group goal or outcome. And so I think for me, like I'm always trying to balance giving space for people to express and vent, and feel heard, with the fact that oversharing can also be a thing. And some
Mhm.
people, because they're really wrapped up in whatever's going on with them, that's all they see the world, right? And so to a point, like it can also become toxic for the individual and the group if there's over exasperated focus on emotions or needs, or if we're not able to move forward from that, or if that same
Yeah.
individual is the one that is always bringing these things up. So just, I guess, curiosities, whether it's now or later, if there are tips that
Mm.
maybe you've seen to be effective in those scenarios that could
Yeah.
help us better navigate those waters.
Thank you. Would you mind just saying your name for me, because that's what I'd like to get it right.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for asking. It's Merengues.
Merengues. Okay. Thank you, Merengues. So, yes, so much of what you're saying matches my experience, and my guess would be the experience of many other people. And this is why it is that the most important thing, or one of the central things that we're looking at engaging in conflict, is that we're checking in with ourselves and with others about where we are in terms of connection during the conversation. And so what I would say in terms of a tip or a thing to consider is that if you're in a conversation and so it's touched on someone's trauma, they're triggered in some way, and that becomes the focus of the conversation, then you're no longer in the conversation about the stuff, about the point of the conflict. What you're actually dealing with is impact. And so that's a choice point for us, is that you can either choose to give time and attention to what is triggering the person, and it's really is up to you to make that choice, because that would depend on your own relationship, your own capacity. Or you can choose to pause the conversation or to reframe the conversation with the person's permission about focusing on the thing that the actual point that the conflict is on. And you can do that by acknowledging that their experience is important, and that it feels, you could say something along the lines of, um, like, I really value what it is that you're sharing with me about what's difficult for you about this piece. And what I would like to really walk away from is to really also have a sense of what's really meaningful and valuable for you about what has happened. And so I'm just, something along the lines like, I'd like to explore more about what was happening for you at the moment that we disconnected. Is that something that you feel like that you're prepared to continue to do? Or would you like to take a pause and to come back to it? So you have different strategies that you can engage in. If it's someone that you have a relationship with and you have capacity, yes. And I see this point here that Catherine has made, people about not being aware of the triggers. And this is true, but what I'm inviting you to consider is your own awareness as to whether or not you're on track with the conversation, or if the conversation has moved to impact. If the conversation has moved to impact, you'll need them to affirm whether or not they've been triggered. You would know whether or not you're inside or outside your own capacity to continue that conversation. And because trust is such an important piece of this, I would say that you want to stay within your level of capacity with the conversation, and to give people time to take care of their own needs. Unless they give you unless they name a specific way that you can support, that you can actually consider. I'm wondering how it is to hear that. Uh, May Rangiz.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, thank you. No, that's definitely helpful. And I really appreciate just like the echoing back, and then also giving people the options and checking in with yourself. Like, do you have the bandwidth? Because I know a lot of times we end up sacrificing our own energy for the purpose of the group advancing, but
Yeah.
we have all this burnout.
Yeah,
So,
exactly it. Yeah, so this is why we talked about these at the interpersonal level, because what's happening for you is important. And if you feel like this is too much of a stretch for me, exit the conversation with
right.
as much love as possible.
Yeah.
And I speak from experience. I was a director of HR for a very long time. You can imagine the kind of conversations I would have with people. People would come into my office and I'd be talking about something and they would start to cry. And my strategy was I'd push the box of Kleenex closer to them and give them time to cry. And it wasn't my job to manage it or to
Right.
feel better, because I don't know where the crying's coming from. And I don't have the education or the time to figure out all that stuff going back. But I can give, in the moment, I could give space for them to go through what it is that they're going through. So there's a way for us to be witness to people's trauma and not take it on as our job to
Absolutely.
fix it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. And Brendan wrote, notice shift no longer in the same conversation. So you've entered a choice point. Consider to pause, reframe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's such an important piece that when impact happens, just give space for to attend to it. Okay. I'm going to, again, I'm so nervous about sharing my screen because I don't want my computer to fry. But some considerations around feelings. So you want to think through which feelings are going to be more like connecting. So when we're having, so what I mean by that is we discovered when we're looking at the feelings and the needs that sometimes they can be things that both people might share or both sides might be sharing. So there's some commonality that's there. We also want to remember that our positionality shapes if we can access and can name with a sense of safety our own feelings. So this is the piece I mentioned before, that you might want to make guesses around feelings, but you might not want to share them. And the reason why is because particularly in conflict, if we guess the wrong feelings in particular, it can end up being disconnecting, and that a person feels like, oh, if you've gotten it wrong, you're getting me wrong, like you're not understanding me. And so that can end up creating like an impact, but there's still a value in you taking time to think through and reflect the feeling pieces. So, and feelings are important. They can be important if this conversation is happening with people of different backgrounds, because as we said, people might be reacting to different things, including things that we may not understand. And so we just want to make room for the reality of what feelings people might be bringing into any situation. And when we're looking at needs in conflict, we want to start with the unmet needs, and then we want to move to naming what met needs are through the question. This is my favorite question around nonviolent communication, which is to think about, if the needs were met, what would it look like? So if you had a need for, if in this scenario that there was a need for like consistency and predictability, to have a conversation about what that would look like, to be able to say something along the lines of, part of me is struggling to understand, or questions whether or not questions whether or not we have the same idea of timeliness. Because for me, in order to have consistency and to really take on my responsibility as the project lead, it's important that I follow the timeline that we agreed to. And so so for me, what consistency looks like is that we're evaluating things based off of a timeline. And you could also name, the ways that you are open or would welcome like disruption of that way of being. That certainly if something is coming up and there's a sense of urgency, maybe we could talk about a way for you and I to think about how we might approach that, which is going to move to agreements, which we're going to talk to, but which we'll speak to shortly. So that looking at the needs can be done again at the interpersonal, what am I needing? Interpersonal, what are we needing between us? And at the systemic levels. So if my need for respect was met, I would have a heads up. If my need was respect, that's at the interpersonal. At the interpersonal, if my need for respect from you was met, we would have not started this conversation in the group chat, but given each other time to hear things out. At the systemic level, if our community's needs for respect was met, we would honor our policies and practices about how to raise concerns. That's just looking at one need at those three levels. But what we're trying to do in this moment by doing this work is to, again, we want to put on the table as much considerations as needed that will help us to work towards having some sense of connection and perhaps finding solutions that will work for more and more people. I just want to pause there to see if that's being sufficiently clear or any reactions. Clarifying questions around these intervention pieces, welcoming the voice of anyone. Thank you so much. Just loving everything you shared. Anyone else?
I'm struggling a little bit with projecting an actual conflict that I'm dealing with
Okay.
into this
Mm-hmm.
scenario that you've created. And what I'm wrestling with is an individual who I would say perhaps has an unawareness of their own needs and an unwillingness to talk about anything on that level at all.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like hugely vulnerable and exposing for that individual. And it puts me in a place where I feel like I can only ever deal with the presenting problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of harking back to something you said a moment ago about if you get the feeling wrong, you can make things worse.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for naming that. I wonder if the conversation that needs to be had is not around the conflict, but around the relationship piece. Like to name where it is that you're struggling and what you actually would welcome or would like to invite. And then to hear from the person, if they can't share anything, what would help them to kind of step towards that.
That feels like a nugget that I want to write down and ponder.
Okay, yeah, exactly it. Yeah. Because oftentimes when we can't even get to, if we can't get even to like where the difference is or what the issue is, we might be running into a wall of the person's capacity, which is impacting the relationship that we can have. And so, yeah, I would invite having a conversation about the relationship and perhaps being more like being able to like articulate, what's on offer here, and that you're willing to find ways to help to build that, to see if that's a place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for raising that though, Catherine. Rav, welcoming your voice.
Thanks. Yeah, similarly, something that's coming to mind for me right now is like if I'm in a conflict with somebody and they are also aware of this technique and tool, and we're both using it in the conversation, that's great. Maybe easy. But if I'm engaging with someone who is not aware of these techniques, doesn't know this like communication model, it's difficult when you're trying to do all these things and not project and not like bring your bias in and everything, but then you're also trying to like facilitate the conversation in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that you just said is true. So the reason why it is difficult to come to a place of understanding when there's been disconnection or a misunderstanding, it is more challenging if somebody doesn't know these skills. But with nonviolent communication, with these skills around nonviolence, they don't require that the person that you're engaged in have the same set of skills. This is about you and how these principles, these values change you. So we're never going to, it's never useful to engage in nonviolent communication conversation or to use nonviolence or NVC with the hope that it will change how the other person will behave, because we have zero control over other people's behavior. So things that we have to, this is why I've talked about looking at things at the intrapersonal level, is because you want to be able to manage yourself through this, because you will be doing more of the heavy lifting. Most people that we're going to be in conversation with do have those Western way of thinking. You'll want to have a question around exploring needs, and they'll want to jump in with some strategy or whatever. And so you will have to say, yep, I'm really appreciating that, but I really want to understand a little bit more about what's happening here, because I think it will help us in the long run. I have a couple more questions. Are you willing to hear them? So you're going to be, you will be wanting to slow things down, and someone will come to you with what is normative. I mean, there's nothing wrong with these people. They're not like particularly messed up. It's just a normative thing where people will come with scarcity and competition and with a sense of speed and a sense of urgency. But that is more difficult and challenging, for sure. The argument that I would make and that we would make in terms of our own work and our commitment as Necessary Trouble Collective and as people committed to nonviolence is that where the relationship is, that it's important to look for having a sense of connection when we are trying to attend to difference. And it's because we know what the consequences are. If we go head to head at the same speed, oftentimes that leads to further disconnection and mistrust. And so if you're wanting to build relationship or to preserve relationship, that's why we're inviting the invitation. This is why we have the invitation to use these tools, but they will slow things down and it will be challenging. That being said, the more that you practice with it, the more fluency that you'll have. It will get faster. I can speak from experience with this.
I just feel like I want to say thank you for a fantastic parenting class this evening. I'm dealing with teenagers, and but it's so interesting because I think I mean, I'm still at, like, if I could even just ask, and what you said very early on about looking at conflict through the lens of needs, that's where I've been just sort of not stuck. Like that's where I'm sort of at, and
Yeah.
trying to figure out how all of that looks. And I love what you just stating, because I think what makes this feel possible is just it's about our relationship with ourself first,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I appreciated that you brought that in that diagram as well, and your story about pushing the box of tissues towards someone and just making space, and just that reminder of like, we know our capacity, and to be respectful of that. Like that's a love, that's sort of a boundary made with love and respect is what you
Yeah.
were
And
saying.
that's it.
Yeah.
That's at the heart of nonviolence, is that everything that we do with some sense of love. And that's what we can establish boundaries with love. We can say no with love. We can do all of those things with love. And that's all that we're trying to do. So I'm glad that you find it that it's helpful, including it in the parenting realm, which I know is a particular place of passion for Catherine. Yeah. Anything that you wanted to share, Catherine?
Well, there was a note in the chat that you might want
Okay.
to have a look at.
Okay, yes, I hear what Rav is saying. It feels like what would be helpful for me personally is the need to learn more about trauma responses and suggestion responses to redirect and invite in. Yeah, I think that can be a great thing to learn more about, but I actually think that we know more than we think we do. And that's because my sense is that when disconnection happens in a conversation or in a relationship, our nervous systems are so wired to catch things even if we don't fully understand it, that we have enough information to know when to pause. So for example, oftentimes when I do work with people who are wanting to like learn about like anti-racism, for example, people will want to like learn and study about like racism, which is great. But the place that I invite people to consider and to work with is when you're in the conversation, well, especially because I do conflict resolution with people, I'm like, do you remember the person going quiet? And people will be like, yeah, I remember that something shifted. And what did you do? I continued the conversation, which is what we all do. And so what I would invite you to consider is to actually to learn how to listen to your nervous system in that moment. Because that oftentimes, if we step and do an intervention in those moments, and it could be something as simple as, I don't know if it's just me, but it just seems like we were in a different kind of flow a few minutes ago and that things have gone quiet. And I just want to check to see if there's anything that's up or if there's anything that we need or if we should slow things down, something. Just to trust your instinct enough to question or to invite the person into naming and to co-holding what's happening. So I hope that's, yes, oh, thank you. That's great advice, yeah. Because that is it. I mean, these tools can be, these tools, nonviolent communication and nonviolent, but NVC in particular, is a somatic tool. It just uses language as its media or as its mechanism, but it is a somatic tool, absolutely. Okay, so I just wanted to speak to a little bit, just quickly, because then I'm going to turn things over to close things out, that the invitation that we have in terms of these interventions is that what we're trying to do is essentially to reestablish trust, because conflict and disagreements, they always have, there's always a meaning to them. People don't start arguments for no reason, never, ever. There's always a reason. And so if you can honor that and be curious about that, then we are starting to put the bricks in place to start to strengthen up and shore up where trust has been eroded. And so we can do that oftentimes by using these tools and also by setting agreements that have some strength to them. And so some considerations are here. I'm not going to mention them all for time's sake. But when we're looking, when we're in conversation with people, and this doesn't happen necessarily at the end, this could be along the way as we're getting a place to a clear understanding, our shared understanding around things, we want to establish agreements that are doable. And what I mean by that is that for me, my test of this is that it describes behavior, because behavior is doable. So asking somebody, will you speak to me respectfully, is not a doable request. But saying to somebody, are you willing to, hear from me if you're speaking to me like at a volume that I don't enjoy? That's a doable request. So you're describing behavior that outlines what success will look like. Establish timelines. Timelines are important. Oftentimes we don't include them in agreements. And by timelines, I don't mean that your behavior will change by this date, but like timelines to check in to see, is this working for you? Is there more information that we have learned that we want to include in any agreement that we have moving forward? So you want to schedule a follow-up. And you want to be, also include in the agreement what will happen if the agreement is not followed. So if you have, if for example, the same person has gone again back to the group chat instead of coming to the person one-on-one, you want to include in your agreement, how would you like me, you could ask the question, how would you like me to let you know when I feel like we're outside of the agreement? What's the best way for me to approach you about that? And you want to, the reason why you're doing that is not so that you can remake the same agreement, but you want to actually be learning. Like, why the person chose to go back to the group chat. So you want to again explore what the set of needs are around there. You don't want to be satisfied. Well, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to try again. That's not descriptive enough for it to be solid. So you want to have enough information to trust that you have a clear path forward. And so with that, I want to just make room for any final questions or other scenarios before turning things over to Catherine to close our time. And we have time to hear a scenario or to have any other comments or clarifying questions. So.
I have so many thoughts fly through my head. It's amazing that it's already been almost an hour and a half to me.
Well, we're in contact, Brendan. So, well, yeah. So feel free at any time, at any point, to reach out. Thank you for naming that. That's helpful. Thank you, Heather. Yeah. So, unless something's come up, then I just want to thank you for your time and attention. And Catherine has some information to share before to close us out. Catherine?
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to stop the recording in case that